number 16 of the Debrief Podcast. I'm Josh Durso, joined by Jackie Augustine. As always, we're here in the FingerLakes1.com studio. 2018 has arrived. How's it been for you so far?
Very good, thank you.
We're alive.
Yeah.
We're well. We're
Yes.
doing things the right way.
Well, attempting to, right?
We're getting there.
Yeah.
We're getting there. So obviously it's been a pretty interesting, busy news cycle the last couple weeks. Obviously,
Yes.
Early January is always interesting because of the state of the state. And it's like state news goes from a really, really, really slow, you hardly hear anything, to just like you're being pummeled with like 10 news stories a day about all these different things.
Yeah, especially given that it's an election year, right? So we have, we're going to hear a lot more about state issues, I think.
So before we start grinding into those, because there are a lot, we could actually probably spend an entire show just going over some of these proposals, some of which are really bizarre.
Right. Yes.
Like things you just but first, we are going to talk about some local stuff. The search is happening. It's underway. It's a national search, as I understand, correct?
Well, I mean, that's a good question. I admit that I don't have a good understanding of what the search process or criteria are going to be for the city manager, which is a little concerning. I understand, and I'm never a person who says, let's just do things the way they've always been done for, just for the heck of it. But it is interesting that the past 2 times that council has hired a manager, there was a clear articulation at a city council meeting, then again in the newspaper, about what the process would be, what the public input was going to be, when people would get a sense of what the process is and where they might participate in it. And maybe I'm missing it, but I haven't heard a whole lot about that. I mean, have you?
It's been interesting, and I guess I was sort of relieved when I saw that they were at least allowing those who have been so crucial in Geneva's success over the last several years to share the responsibilities moving forward. I was a little confused about the timeline, a span of several months, and yes, I realize that's a lot of time, but thinking about it from the public input / governing side, you're talking about what would ultimately be, and I'm not sure if they've already began advertising for the position, or where that stands in the process, but January is done. You're talking about February, March, April, May, and I think June or July was when I had read last that that City Council hoped to make a decision by. You're talking about like 3 or 4 decision cycles.
Right.
From, going through the various committees, and then you get into City Council, and I'm assuming that, if this is truly a national search, you're going to have some schedules to work around and work out. Because, if someone from Virginia wants the job or someone from Montana wants the job, then they're going to have to get here from there.
Yep.
And, I think that's, for presumably more than one interview.
Yeah, the way it was done last time, which I actually think was a good model. So I hope that they are at least thinking about and referring back to what worked. If they agree that hiring Matt when we did was the right decision, right, then you would look back at the process and say, how might that process be replicated? But the idea of bringing somebody from, and yes, it should absolutely be a national search. I certainly can't think of any Geneva candidates who would be a good fit for this position. And regionally, I think it would be an incredibly short list. I really do think we're looking at a national search. When you bring somebody in for a position like this, you're not just bringing them in for an interview. They need to learn as much about us as we're trying to learn about them, right? So they have to come in, get a feel for Geneva, spend some time with not necessarily currently vested interests, but just kind of exploring the city, Last time when Matt and other candidates came in to visit, there was also a session with management staff where management staff could ask their own questions, not formulated or vetted by city council, but just things about city operations and philosophy of governance that they felt were most critical to what they knew about the city's operations, which is a lot. And especially now, yeah, I mean, I think that a really deliberate process, I think slower's better. I think the three people, Doris, Sage, and Adam, serving as this kind of triumvirate is excellent. I actually think that's a really great idea.
Is that a permanent solution? Could that be a permanent solution?
Do I think it could be a permanent solution?
I've heard
to have
people
a management
ask that
team?
question. I mean, do a management,
Yeah.
sort of like a triangle of, rather than just giving it all the power to one person,
Right.
all the direction to one person.
Yes, let me say this. In an ideal circumstance, yes, a management team concept like this, I think, would be the hallmark of a really well-functioning city. Unfortunately, in a city that is lacking a bit on the policy direction front, I'm not sure that strategy works long-term. I don't know. I wish it could, but I'm not as optimistic. I kind of think you do need a city manager mostly to direct council. Unfortunately. And that's not the way it's supposed to go. So that's a total inversion of the power structure.
That's the way it tends to go in regionally, I'll say. I'll just say regionally.
Well,
because
yeah,
that
and I
tends to
think
be, when you look at local boards, city councils, they tend to take that sort of, is this where we're supposed to go?
Right.
Attitude from that type of leader.
Yeah, that's where the problems come in. But
I do think it's really interesting because I think Matt Horn did a really good job of keeping those three individuals involved in all of the processes to keep Geneva going in the first place, and that's probably one of the big reasons why, plus their own experience, why they're able to fill that gap so seamlessly. But it just seems to me, if you're looking at it from the public input side and you're really interested in fulfilling what the community wants, it is really, really important to not make a decision. I'm not even sure months is fitting. Like, I think maybe you need to spread it out to almost a year at that point if you really are serious about getting the community's input. And what will that exposure even be? Like, I have trouble imagining what, as you go through this process, you have candidates who will typically sit down in executive session or in some, format like that, because it is a personnel matter and it doesn't have to be handled in the public setting. But at the same time, Geneva, the city of Geneva, has been a public that has really demanded more transparency, demanded to be involved. And I think that, city council has a really hard job of trying to figure out how to balance all of those things without just coming off as a council that's going to make the decision they want to make and impose their will on the community.
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes back to the discussion that we had last time that city council is really in a position right now to communicate to the public what they think about the public. So right now, the overwhelming message of 2017 was that they're afraid of the public, that public input is not something they handle well, that, these attempts to quelch public comment, to say you can't say their names. I mean, all this kind of stuff showed a real angst about interacting with the people who elected them. So I think the city manager search is a great way to kick off 2018 and say, guess what, members of the public who are technically our boss, we are not afraid of you. We take seriously the contributions you can make. We agree that we're going to make a better community decision if more members of the community are involved in the decision making. And here is a logical structure for getting input in a way that allows as many people to be heard as possible without kind of biasing the discussion toward just the people who have traditionally been at the table, if that makes sense.
Yeah, well, I kind of, as soon as you started to say that, I thought to myself, well, has the city of Geneva created any sort of public committee, any sort of like members of the public at large who would be involved in this process on the official side, it wouldn't be unheard of to involve a select few members of the community who represent various interests and groups to be part of a board that could ultimately make a decision or at least make a suggestion.
Yeah, and I mean, that's how it's been done a couple times in the past. It's funny that you say that because I had this conversation with one of our former mayors because when Stu Einstein became the mayor, that's when the former city manager, Rich Rising, had to resign, and that's when we had to undertake this process to hire Matt. And the first thing he did was appoint Phil Beckley, who had run against him in the mayoral race and lost, as the head of the search committee to show that the city manager has to work for everybody, regardless of partisanship. And although Phil did not play a prominent role in the actual selection, I think that did communicate, like Stu unequivocally cares about people and showed that through his actions. Mm-hmm. So I said, I'm not waiting by the phone for the current mayor to call me up and say, in the spirit of precedent and goodwill, will you help with the search? That's not going to happen, right? I'm not losing any sleep over that. But I agree that actually having participation of members of the public who have an interest in what goes on in the city and various segments that the city manager oversees. For example, the police, code enforcement, to engage people who are affected on a daily basis by the policies that the city manager has to enforce would be really helpful. I'm afraid that if they do involve the public, you're going to see a list of the usual suspects being invited to the table. And that creates a problem because a lot of the usual suspects are people who have business with the city and proposals in the works. And in my opinion, that's a conflict of interest. You should not bring people with business before the city. I'm not saying business people. I'm saying people with projects into that.
I also think that there's probably part of this discussion that needs to revolve around the I'll call them the underrepresented folks. And I'm not just talking about specific groups or people of color or anything else. I'm literally talking about people who don't go to meetings.
Right.
Like people
the majority of the community.
People who don't want to sit through a 4-hour meeting once a month or don't have the time or whatever the case may be. In theory, every single type of person should be represented in some way, shape, or form if that's the process you're going to go through. Not saying it is, and I don't think it will be. I think City Council is pretty much just going to move through the process as they see fit and ultimately make the decision that they think is right. It's really interesting because you take all of the different things that are at play, all the politics, all of the names that have, popped up, disappeared, come back. You always hear about, people who were involved 15, 20 years ago. They're suddenly interested again. But all of this is happening at a time when the next 3, 4, 5 years for Geneva, about as crucial on the economic development front as you could possibly see, especially right after receiving the DRI money. Right. I mean, it's like, hello, this is, on one hand, it was probably the worst time that Matt could have left. And yet, on the other hand, it's obviously it's not his fault. He took a better opportunity and he did what was right for him. And that's a personal decision. That's a personal matter. But for the city just has to be even more on top of its game now. Right. Moving forward. Yeah,
you think about it. The city's been on what I consider to be an upward trajectory, and the DRI maybe is the kind of peak of that, right? And then the current management team in place is going to do a really excellent job of making sure that stays, right? That the things that have been built stay. I don't mean physically built, right? And then so there's some momentum there that can be continued. But it really is up to council to make sure that there isn't backsliding, right? That they don't take their foot off the gas and say, okay, things are better now, so we can just relax. And they need to be really on the lookout for innovative, creative managers. Because if somebody comes in and they say, what we need to do is get that industrial park up and running again, and we've got to find a way to, re-energize things with a lot of pilots. And if someone comes in with a traditional economic toolbox, this council should have enough experience to say, we know that doesn't work here. Like, we know we need something different. We're calling ourselves uniquely urban. We need to put that into practice. That's what I'm worried about. I'm worried that in a time of feeling uncertain, people go back to what they know, even if that wasn't working. Mm-hmm. And, they took a chance on Matt. It worked out. I hope they'll take a chance on whoever is next.
Agreed. It's interesting because it's just like, it's such a big decision. It's such a comprehensive one.
Right.
That to just sort of, and it does seem like the status quo of how you would normally approach this type of decision, city council interviewing some people, making a decision, it just doesn't seem fitting.
Right.
But that's not the only Geneva story on the docket. So obviously there were some really interesting pictures that were published by the Finger Lakes Times.
Yeah. Do you have them? Are you going to pop them up on the screen?
Yeah, I'll pop them up as you start to talk to us about what all of this was about and what it all meant.
Well, everybody has known, I hope, what the ideas of the DRI are and were and where they were headed. And now some of the design drawings are starting to come out because contract documents have to be signed. And I don't want to say people have buyer's remorse, but
this is the controversial sign, by the way. If you're watching us on YouTube, this is the controversial sign that everyone has been up in arms over. A lot of people have been up in arms over.
Yeah, I mean, I'm one of those people who agree that it is the unwelcome sign because if you take a look at it, and I understand this is not a final rendering, but it is the proposal put forward. It's kind of like a throughway overpass sign, that we recycled in the downtown and stuck the logo on. And not only do people feel like it itself is kind of unnecessary, kind of eye garbage. I don't know what else to call it, but that the location where they're going to put it.
I think they would call it eye candy, not eye garbage, well, depending on your point of view.
But I think the bigger issue is where it's located. So it's like a welcome to Geneva, a mile into Geneva sign, which just seems weird. Yeah. So instead, so there were a petition went out not to do the sign and to repurpose the money. And within 2 weeks, there were 450 signatures, both physical signatures that downtown businesses and churches collected, and then online signatures. And that, I mean, there hasn't been that kind of engagement since they tried to put those condos on the lake again and again and again. So, so Fred Brockway, active volunteer in the community, member of the DRI, he went to the last council meeting and spoke and said, hey, people don't want this. The consultants stuck it in there at the last minute because we had to propose more than $10 million so that the state would have something to choose from. But really, we didn't want this. We wanted this resiliency center, and he was advocating for that. And I came up to the podium after he spoke and said, okay, I understand how that happened, and I agree that this sign is awful and should not go there. But I tried to remind people that there was a proposal to put in part of like a pedestrian bike walking trail that would have connected the 6th Ward to the rest of the city. And that needs a bridge, like Ontario Pathways has, like all these trails have. And it would come in within budget, and they could put their signage on it. So I don't know what they're going to do. No one really responded. I mean, a couple counselors said, yes, we agree. We don't want that sign. We let's try something else. But there was no decision. Then this other picture came out. Is that the one you're going to...
I have all of them.
Okay.
All the pictures.
All right.
We have all of the pictures.
Okay, so this is the other one. This is the 5-point intersection. And I think most people agree that having better crossings at this intersection in downtown Geneva is a good idea. But I think everyone I've talked to is hoping that that little graphic in the middle, the little logo, is just for purposes of the printed...
Of the graphic.
Right, that it's not actually going to... Although, at the meeting, it was said, well, we're not sure yet. And I thought, oh my goodness, because here's the thing. Geneva should not be acting like the poor family that wins the lottery and all of a sudden puts rhinestones on everything, right? Like, we don't want to be nouveau riche where we walk around and just kind of bedazzle our downtown. It has to actually serve a purpose, and it's a historic district. So we should do things that are tasteful and that serve the public purpose, which is to help people have better access to the downtown without being all showy about it. And a lot of people have said these raised tabletop intersections don't work, but I can tell you there are many upstate and New England communities that have as much snow as we do who are able to manage raised tabletop intersections.
I was going to say, how well does that hold up?
Yeah, well, I mean, they are more common than you might think, and they are geared toward pedestrians. Cars don't love them, but if the idea is to create a pedestrian-friendly downtown, I don't find that out of line. I think that actually makes good sense, but I just sure hope it's not.
There was so
stenciled.
this when I saw the story in the paper,
yeah,
this was the picture I saw. But then I found the story online, and I actually found another picture that was even more interesting.
Yes,
this to me is the gold standard right here. Because the arterial, it's not even really an arterial. It's like a little segment of just terrible road.
Yes.
Just awful.
It is.
And I pressed both times I had Matt Horn on my show, on my podcast. I pressed him about this because it's you want to talk about ugly. Yeah. It makes the arterial in Auburn look attractive.
Right.
And it surprisingly...
Sorry, Auburn.
It might actually
That's true.
It might actually be the worst as far as your vehicle goes, too, because the road is just...
It's all potholes and,
fill and it's totally cobbed. Now, when I look at this, I think to myself, I'm assuming that's the Ramada on the right side of the image. So that means you're looking back towards Seneca County. I'm interested on the traffic flow side,
right? How
that would work out. Now, in Waterloo... Downtown Waterloo, recently they cut that down. That was once 4 lanes. They cut that down to 2 lanes, and it worked perfectly fine. You reduce the speed limit, and everyone's happier. And that to me, and I am an outsider, a complete outsider, that to me fits the bill of what the whole goal was of connecting the lakefront and downtown. I'd much rather walk across that than cross what's happening there right now with cars going 45, 50 miles an hour. Probably faster than that because people don't like following the speed limits.
Yeah. I mean, and you're totally speaking my language because this is the number one thing I have been hoping would be done forever, probably since I was a little kid, and it changed.
It's just necessary.
Yes. But I mean, I will say that this is not the final design. Luckily, it sounds like they've taken out those roundabouts, which would not have worked. Plus, I mean, I showed them that the New York State traffic code says you're not supposed to put a roundabout within 500 feet of a rail line, and you can't see it here, but the rail is just to the left there. Yeah. So you can't have a roundabout. But anyway, the only concern about this schematic is the planted median in the middle, because I think we should just be honest with the community that let's look at our weather right now. Road salt and plowing is going to make a much different winterscape with a median in the middle than what this picture portrays. And I'm not sure I mean, if we can find hardy enough trees that won't die every winter and will actually bloom like this again in the spring and summer, that's great. But I think there might be other median options they might pursue. People have also said, well, this is totally impractical for the amount of truck traffic. But to that, I have said, we actually did a vehicle study when Waterloo did their study to reduce lanes. And the traffic count actually could support this. Yeah. But also, if this makes trucks want to take a different route, hooray. I mean, that's what we should be wanting. We should be showing in every way we can that these garbage trucks are inconsistent with the Finger Lakes quality of life. So I don't find the truck argument
Trucks
compelling.
of all kinds, not even just, I mean, there are all sorts of truck traffic. It is a state road, so there's all sorts of truck traffic. True. Main artery. I agree though, and there was, I just want to show everyone, there was one other image, nothing really groundbreaking, but I guess just kind of beautifying the city a little bit.
I think it's wherever you have a pedestrian crossing, it's nice to have somewhere for pedestrians to go when they get caught in the middle, because Castle Street is a wide street, and right now, any day of the week, you can go down and watch somebody dashing from the post office across the street to get to where they've parked their car, or going to get a burrito or something. And it's either the cars stop and they get to walk nicely across the street, or it is just kind of dashing across. So I think making everything more pedestrian friendly is the right way to go. But that sign does not achieve it.
The sign's the anomaly out of the entire situation.
It's very industrial. It's very I don't think we need to remind people that we're on the edge of the Rust Belt by putting another metal structure. We've got a lot of nice public art that's gone up lately, and this is a little too much. Okay,
so let's shift gears again. You said fitting with the image of the Finger Lakes. That's a really good segue into our next update, which is obviously the incinerator. There were 2 sessions in the last 5 days that I think are worth mentioning. On Sunday, there was the public forum where you had some educators and experts who oppose incinerator-type facilities speak. And I thought that was really, it was positive, but then at the same time, that was the day we found out that the Public Service Commission, specifically a 7-person siting board, would ultimately be the ones making the decision on whether this sort of circumventing or appearing to circumvent home rule, local law, whatever you want to call it. What's your feeling on that right now as it stands?
Well, I still think it's a horrible idea, and I think the way that they are approaching it shows that this is about their own profit motive and not actually about energy generation or renewable. I mean, I think they've now dropped, or should drop, the pretension that this is some kind of renewable energy, because I think everybody understands it's not. But the idea that somehow this region has been crying out for more electricity generation, and B, that if we do need it, that burning trash is the best, most efficient, healthiest, most environmentally sound, economically viable way to do it, is just laughable. There's no argument. The science doesn't support it. Common sense doesn't support it. So, I think that I think at some point the developers were trying to make it appear as though they were operating in good faith. And then when one thing after another got exposed, as far as, writing the letters about the zoning designation and this, all the stuff that was going on with the zoning officer and the sale of the house and all that kind of stuff. When that started coming out, I think they said, all right, we see where this is headed. We're pulling the plug and we're taking this to someone that might be friendlier to us. And that, to me, just shows the hostility with which this region is being regarded by people who are out to make money.
Now, there's a competing narrative that this is actually the opposite, that the siting board would, in theory, be harder on them could, in theory, see through what the proposal is?
Well, let's look at what the siting board, who's on the siting board, right? So in addition to the standing members, the representatives in the area hopefully will have some input on appointing the other siting board members, but ultimately it's a decision. I think it says
7.
Yes.
It's a 7 board member.
And so the idea that board is going to be well attuned to our interests, I think is somewhat naive, but well, I suppose I'm going to be careful about what I say, because I don't believe the development company is operating in good faith. Mm-hmm. And I think as this story develops and more eyes are on it and a little more sunshine is on it, it will become obvious that there are people who have a stake in this project who are really well connected in Albany, and that makes the lift heavier for us locally who are trying to just defend our own space and air. So I don't believe that they have gone this route because they think it'll be a harder route. I think they're going this route because they think it's the only viable option.
It seems like a longer route. I will say that. I've heard everything that I've heard is that it will take. You're now talking about years. You're not talking about possibly months before a decision could be made.
Well, that's the hope, and that's what happened with the ethanol plant. So the ethanol plant, I think, was stalled long enough that finally the message was clear to everybody that the economics simply didn't work. So when the environmental argument failed and the health issue failed, at least the economic issue put that project to bed.
Right.
But I guess we can only hope for a similar fate for the incinerator, which...
So in a few minutes, we're going to start talking about some state issues, but I kind of want to get your take on how do you think, because a lot of people have been calling for Governor Cuomo to step up and take a stand on a lot of these environmental issues,
right,
whether it's at the southern end of Seneca Lake or this one in Romulus. A lot of folks are saying it's time for the governor to step up and do what he probably should have done to begin with. Where do you put that, and do you think it'll happen? I have my personal views, but I'll hold off until after you have a chance to sort of speak to that before I jump in and attack it.
I have to say I'm of two minds of this on this issue, which is a strange place for me to be because I usually have a strong opinion one way or the other. But on one hand, I can totally see the appeal of having the governor just come out and say, no, we're not doing this. If he were saying that across New York State, right, I would be totally on board. On the other hand, I don't like the idea that a governor could make policy without public input for the state of the region. Because, I mean, think about it. If the tables were turned and we thought that he didn't agree with us, we wouldn't be saying, shouldn't the governor just step in and say, we're putting this incinerator here and incinerators for everybody. So I think the governor's role in this, if I had my druthers, if I could just call him up and say, here's what I think you should do, I think what he should be saying, and what would be really great for everybody, is that New York State is addicted to trash, and it is not sustainable, it's environmentally unjust, it's economically unjust, and it is time to actually put a moratorium on any additional facilities that deal with trash. Now, you might say, well, then what do we do with our trash? Okay, we've already got capacity, but if people knew that they weren't going to have another option, then we might actually take seriously the things that other states, other countries who are way ahead of us on these issues are doing, which is increasing recycling, reducing packaging, sensible strategies that reduce the waste stream and actually tackle the root cause of the problem. Do I think he'll do that? No. But in my opinion, that's what I would like to see the governor do.
So I've heard, as usual, I'm taking a much more cynical turn on this. I've heard several people say that this would end up being the largest incineration facility either in the U.S. or in the world, depending on scope and the exact logistics of it when all is said and done.
Okay.
If that's the case, I don't see the governor, just like with the issue at the southern end of the lake, I don't see him making a decision until after he wins re-election, assuming he wins re-election.
Right.
And at that point, if the discussion or debate is still local, still just, I'll say even regional, where we're the only ones saying, hey, this is, the Finger Lakes is the only group saying, this isn't renewable, this isn't friendly, this isn't environmentally progressive, whatever the term you want to attach to it, he will be able to use that in his bid in 2020 if he really is going to use this as a jumping point, this third term as governor, jumping point to run for the White House in 2020. Yeah. I just think that, and at that point, does it work for him to, say yes to the incinerator and no to other things, and then be able to tout the fact that, New York features an incinerator, a world-class incinerator? To me, I think of the politics of it, and it's. I know he's not going to make a decision, and I know Albany isn't going to make a decision on any of these controversial issues until after this election cycle. It's not going to happen.
Yeah, I don't think that part's cynical. I think that's realistic. The rest of it might have been a little cynical, but that part I think is realistic. Yeah.
Here's the thing, though, and I've said this I've talked to a couple other people about this, and it's like, would you put it past Albany? Would you put it past the governor? Would you put it past the current status quo of leadership in New York State? If that doesn't seem far-fetched, then it could easily be a reality. Right.
No, that's the fear. That's the... I mean, he might as well then just change the logo instead of I love New York to I burn New York, put a little incinerator in the middle. I mean,
That's cynical. Okay, that's cynical.
Well, if that would be the strategy, and if this really would be the largest facility, I wasn't aware of that, but I guess I want to caution referring to this incinerator as the largest incinerator because right now, I think the developers of this proposal, in order to get before the Public Service Commission, they have to meet this threshold, this 25 megawatt threshold or whatever, production threshold. Really, and City Council had a great presentation at the last council meeting by Darren McGee, who has studied these issues internationally, that their production estimates, they haven't really provided a lot of documentation. So it's in their favor to talk about how big and how much this might generate because that bolsters their position in going to the Public Service Commission. I'm not convinced that this operation is going to be anything more than like Syracuse's. They're going to build it, they're going to turn the operations over to somebody, cash out, and then we're going to be stuck with it. I don't think the people proposing it, none of the people who were in the room for the initial proposal were incinerator operators. Mm-hmm. So that's still the missing piece. So sorry, that kind of went off on a tangent there, but I just wanted to make that point that I'm not convinced this thing is going to be anything that someone could point to as
even if it falls, but that's the thing. If they are, so continuing down that line of logic, assuming going to this commission allows them, a blank check of the sorts.
I hope not, but yeah.
It could be. If
then they might as well go all the way with it. Right. Yes, that is a worry. That is definitely a worry because I can't imagine anyone saying, well, there's an unlimited supply of trash and we could make millions of dollars. We better not. That just doesn't happen that way, unfortunately.
I also want to point out, you hear phrases like first of its kind, world class, the largest, one of the largest, all those things,
Yeah.
they are just, ultimately, they end up being political chips that are used down the line. And that seems to be, if you look back at various projects and how they end, and
Right.
that's typically what you see, and it just, it's a worry. It's a worry.
Yeah, we've become kind of a population that loves adjectives without really looking at the content to which those adjectives are being attached.
Yeah. Another interesting story that popped up just over the last few days, school taxes, property taxes. It's so unlivable in New York State, they say, right? It's what everybody tells us.
Yeah.
So a proposal by Senate Republicans say that the state would make up for a difference in budget loss by cutting future spending, while supporters of this proposal, which would phase out over a 10-year period, it would first freeze and then phase out school taxes for seniors over the age of 65. So my big issue with this type of proposal, and Senate Republicans, I'm happy that they're, speaking this type of language, and maybe they're genuine about, wanting to follow through on this. But if you are saying that the government will make up for the budget losses,
Right.
and you don't know who's going to make up that government 10 years from now, how can you promise that right out of the gate?
Right, and how can you sell it as a tax cut when really it ends up being a double tax on the remaining taxpayers? Because being paid for by the government is being paid for by the people who fund the government.
Right, and several have said, and this is reportedly, I'm going to say reportedly, they've said that it will be made up for through cuts, through other cuts. So they will figure out how to save the money to make up for the loss, and it will all, eventually everything will become whole again.
Yeah, maybe what they're planning on cutting is health care for senior citizens, and then in their mind that might take care of the problem, which is a terrible... I mean, this is what I can't get my head around. I don't understand why politicians, regardless of their political affiliation, why they don't talk about programs as being community activities, right? So like funding schools or community activities, funding police departments or community activities, fire departments, etc. So isn't the question really how to fairly distribute that burden of paying for these community ends? And instead, it's like, well, we want to give seniors this, or we want to give businesses this, without contextualizing it in terms of proportionality and fairness. And I don't know. I guess I'm just expecting something unreasonable at this point. But
so one of my big concerns is the fact that obviously there's already a giant budget gap looming.
Right.
And when you start talking about, well, the government's going to take in less unless there's a really effective plan to cut spending, overall spending.
Right.
A and B aren't going to equal out. It's not going to work.
Yeah. And I agree that there are seniors across New York State, across the country, right, who are struggling, but not every person, by virtue of being age 65, is thereby overburdened by their school taxes, right? I mean, within any age group, there are the same income considerations that you have amongst any other age group. So I think that going to any one group is always a disingenuous, political move, instead of tracking things to try to get at the root problem. There are people who have trouble paying their school taxes, and that should be addressed, but you can't use this broad brush approach to what is actually a very kind of detailed problem.
It's complicated.
It is complicated.
And if you look at the local level, obviously school taxes are very high.
Yeah.
So this is, but you flip it around and you say, of all the places you're going to cut something that ends up impacting our future generations.
Right. I mean, it's like you're getting these soundbite solutions for paragraph policies, right? Mm-hmm. Like pages of policy. You can't just say, "Oh, the solution is this." I mean, it's just not that.
So this isn't one of the things we were going to talk about, but the payroll tax versus an income tax. Did you catch that one from
I did not.
Governor? So Governor Cuomo, during his State of the State, one of the things that he proposed, that he talked about, was completely overhauling the state tax system and moving away from an income tax and onto a payroll tax. And there again, it's super broad. It might work, but at the end of the day, it doesn't address the problem.
Right.
Your spending is still higher than it should be.
Right? I did hear that, and I think I kind of quickly dismissed it as something that wasn't going to get any traction, so I hadn't looked at it. But you're right. That's another good example. And there were a lot of proposals in the State of the State address that, in some ways, I think are really on the right track, but again, kind of missed the mark. And I think that we talked about that in terms of the minimum wage. But there were others, like this proposal about certainty in scheduling, where like people would have to be paid for 4 hours worth of work, even if it ends up that they aren't needed that entire time. And in theory, for some classes of workers, that makes a total amount of sense. But to make that like a blanket proposal in other cases doesn't make any sense at all. And it's like this partisanship prevents people from having a conversation about what is the policy, how does it work in practice across many groups. I mean, you've got people making laws who frankly are so out of touch with the lives of regular people, and it ends up being...
So taking that proposal as an example, because I wrote my last column in the Finger Lakes Times about that, taking from my past work experience, my past life experience, it was one of those things where if you excluded small businesses, if you excluded those employers and those groups who would be hardest hit by yet another wage requirement,
right,
it would be fine.
Yes.
The corporate entities that can more than readily afford to cover that kind of issue, and if nothing else, it really spoke to me because it's a system issue. So you need to have a more innovative scheduling system. Right. You need to be smarter about how you manage your people in those situations where if you're a retail entity and you know that there is a giant snowstorm coming, which, by the way, Finger Lakes, there is right now, you should already know that tomorrow is not going to be a very busy day.
Right.
You can start calling people. It always amazed me because you have these giant companies, all the money in the world. They can afford to do all the studies. They can afford to do all the things that the small businesses can't afford to do to get themselves out of these situations. But it's fine the way it is. They're good. They're content with the way things are. Yeah. And that's mind-boggling to me. So when I see a proposal like this, I say, well, too bad for those folks. Too bad for those corporate interests. I don't feel bad for them.
Right. And I think that's the whole point. Like, there is a difference between a large multinational employer, right, who treats their employees like widgets. Like, they don't know who they are. They just shuffle them around, treat them however they want. Yes, people who work for that like need protection. If I'm working for a small business where I see the person, I know them well, I can say, look, what's going on, this isn't going to work, but we can make up the time somewhere else. Why don't you stay home? It's safer for you. Like, that's a totally different work culture. So, but frankly, I believe because most legislative officials have never worked in situations like that, they have no frame of reference, and they frankly don't associate with people who work in those situations. So that is a problem. That's a problem. We're being dominated by people who have no concept of reality.
But I still have hope.
I do too, and I don't mean to end it on that.
We sound incredibly cynical.
I know. What's happening?
Hits and misses. Let's go.
Okay.
Let's do this. Want me to go first? I'll go first.
Yes, you go first.
Okay. My miss. I'll start with my miss. One of Cuomo's proposals during his State of the State included some criminal justice reforms, removing bail on minor offenses. I called that a miss because it's like,
interesting.
Of all the things you could do to correct and overhaul the criminal justice system to make it better, I don't even want to call that low-hanging fruit. That is so common sense. I would call that a hit if they passed it, and get it through, that's fine. But I see what ends up happening, and it would be afterwards, viewed as, oh, we made great strides this year in criminal justice reform. Right. You took bail off of minor offenses. Right. Get out of here. No, that's not meaningful. That's not meaningful change.
Right.
Can it have a positive impact? Sure. If they pass it, if Senate and Assembly can get behind it and get it into the budget, and more power to them, I'd be totally content with it. But just at face value, as a criminal justice reform, that's not a reform.
Right.
That's not a reform.
Okay.
My hit, Cuomo is continuing his pursuit of cashless tolling, and also some improved throughway plazas along the throughway throughout the state. I'm a huge fan of this. I think, if you are a frequent flyer on the New York State Thruway like I am, you get pretty frustrated with even the easy pass lanes being completely congested, completely crowded, and it winds up taking it almost, in some cases, if you hit it during rush hour, it eliminates the benefit of using the Thruway, which is, the idea that this is supposed to be faster, more efficient. I realized that there would be to some degree, job loss, but it would also save money in the long term, assuming they're able to cut the payroll end of it down. It's just progress, moving things forward. I think the other item within that debate that a lot of people aren't realizing is that you're still going to have people managing and taking care of the machines and everything, the computers that would ultimately be handling all the various things there. So, there's actually an opportunity, I think, for better jobs at throughway stops along the state, and I think that is something to think about as you go forward. I think it's only a matter of time, regardless, before this is the norm. So, do it right, and don't be the roadblock to change just because. Think about it, move forward in a sensible way, and invest in the throughway plazas. People who are coming to the Finger Lakes, they vary. If you look at using Seneca County as the sort of as a standard, I guess, something like 80% of the county's traffic comes from exit 41. So, from that north end, people are less and less taking the scenic route. Not that that's a good thing or a bad thing. That's just the way people are. You're on vacation with your kids. You want to get to where you're going and enjoy the place you set out to visit. So that's that. We'll be talking about those, I'm sure, as we move closer to April, when hopefully the state can get it together and get an agenda or a budget passed.
All right. Yeah, we are going to talk about those again, because I think eliminating cash bail is a good criminal justice reform, but I agree with you. It is not.
It's weak.
Yes, it's not.
It's weak.
He's not taking the biggest bite out of the apple there. So yeah, my hit would be the forum that was on Sunday. Now, full disclosure, I was unable to attend. However,
I know, because I was looking for you there, because I was there.
Sorry to let you down, but I wasn't able to attend. But I have to say, I am fully in support of any group or coalition of groups taking it upon themselves to have open, well-informed dialogue about pressing issues of the day. More of that. And the groups that pulled it together, excellent job. And yes, I think that is a model to replicate for lots of issues. So I hope that the fact that it was so well attended encourages people that this is the kind of stuff that we need to continue doing. My miss is also about the governor's State of the State address. And it is the fact that I think he clocked in at 1:08 talking about ethics reform. And I mean, look, at this year, we are going to see several government officials or people affiliated with government positions who have been indicted. We're going to see Sheldon Silver and Dean Skelos back again, tried again. They got off on a technicality. They'll be back to answer to the initial charges or revised charges. And this is a serious issue. And I understand that for the powers that be, they have a vested interest in having state government run the way it's always run. But for all of us, we need to pay closer attention and really demand ethics reform, especially as regards these LLCs and dual office holding. Well, not dual office holding, but the ability for legislators to hold a job or to get income from another source while they're holding the legislative office. Because not only does that mean they really are part-time and probably aren't paying as close attention as they should, but also that they have a conflict of interest. I mean, they have to, and they're always going to be positioning themselves to get that paycheck. So, yeah, my miss is lack of attention to ethics.
I agree with all of that. It's amazing because ethics is just something that, you know, it's every 6 months somebody will say something very broad and very it's hit at a distance and then it's forgotten about in a minute
it's
and 8
fundamental
seconds.
It is the fundamental fix. But
well, hey, that's it for today. That's it. We've talked about enough. We'll be back in a couple weeks. In the meantime, let us know what's on your mind. We'd love to hear from you. Check out all of our episodes on fingerlakes1.tv and check out our Facebook page for highlights from this and other podcasts. Thanks for listening, and we will see you next time.